The snatch was, in Theron's professional opinion, flawless. His men, the Silent Shadows, as they were uncreatively known in the Undercity, moved with a fluid lethality he had personally drilled into them. The target, Lady Rosalind Valerius, was isolated from her guards by a staged carriage malfunction, a classic but effective. A whisper of drugged cloth, a swift and silent transfer to an unmarked vehicle, and they were melting back into the city's grimy arteries before the lady's footman had even figured out which wheel had been sabotaged. It was clean, it was efficient. It was, Theron thought with a grim satisfaction that was the closest he ever came to joy, a masterpiece of criminal logistics. And then the masterpiece began to speak. "You know," she said, her voice muffled slightly by the velvet hood but losing none of its crisp, critical tone, "if you'd cinched the knot from the opposing direction, you could have created a self-tightening loop. This current arrangement is amateurish. I could work my way out of it in 5 minutes if I felt a pressing need to, which, frankly, given the upholstery in this carriage, I do not." Theron, seated opposite her, felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. He was Theron, the Shadow King, the undisputed master of all enterprises between the sewers and the skyways. His name was a hush in taverns, a threat in boardrooms. No one offered him unsolicited advice on rope tying. He remained silent. A king did not engage with cargo. Also, the chloroform, or whatever budget sedative you used, was applied with far too much vigor, she continued, shifting in her seat. "A proper application should induce unconsciousness in seconds. I was merely feigning for the sake of appearances. Your man, the large one with the unfortunate facial scar, nearly dislocated my shoulder. There's a finesse to these things. You can't just brute force abduction." The muscle in his jaw was now staging a full-scale rebellion. He glanced at Cale, the large man with the unfortunate facial scar, who was driving. The back of Cale's neck was a furious shade of crimson. "It's a simple matter of leverage," she lectured the darkness. "You use the victim's own weight against them. It's elegant. It's resource-conscious." This was messy. I'd give it a 4 out of 10. Points for punctuality, but significant deductions for technique and execution. I know. I'm exhausting. But if you're going to kidnap someone, you might as well do it properly. Theron finally allowed himself to speak, his voice a low gravel that usually made grown men flinch. "Be silent." There was a pause. For a glorious second, he thought she had actually obeyed. "Is that your royal decree?" she asked, a thread of genuine curiosity in her voice. "Because it's a rather blunt instrument for conversation, isn't it? A simple 'please be quiet' would have sufficed, though I can't promise I'd have listened. I find I have a great deal to say on the subject of my own kidnapping." He did not deign to reply. He spent the rest of the journey to his fortress, the Onyx Spire, in a state of simmering disbelief. His flawless operation had a critic, a vocal one. The Onyx Spire was designed to intimidate. It was a brutalist masterpiece of black stone and sharp angles that clawed at the perpetually gray sky of the Undercity. Its halls were vast, cold, and echoed with the weight of Theron's power. Men walked softly here. Voices were kept low. It was a cathedral of fear. Rosalind, once unhooded and deposited into an ornate but uncomfortable-looking chair in the center of his throne room, looked around. Her expression was not one of terror or awe. It was the vaguely disappointed look of a potential homebuyer viewing a property with foundational issues. "Goodness," she said, her gaze sweeping over the high, vaulted ceilings and the single, massive stained-glass window depicting a stylized raven crushing a serpent. "The heating bills in this place must be astronomical. And the echo is a nightmare. You'd never be able to have a private conversation unless you were whispering directly into someone's ear. It's an acoustic disaster. Though, I suppose that's rather the point, isn't it? Form over function, very dramatic." Theron stood before the hearth. the firelight casting his severe features into harsh relief. His throne, a monstrosity of obsidian and cold iron, sat empty behind him. He looked at the woman. She wasn't a classic beauty. Her face was too sharp, her eyes too intelligent. They were a startling shade of green, and they were currently assessing his tapestries with a critical squint. She was supposed to be weeping, pleading. Instead, she was critiquing his interior design. "My fortress was not constructed with coziness in mind, Lady Rosalind," he said, the words clipped. Clearly, she agreed. It was constructed to project an aura of bleak, soul-crushing despair. And it succeeds marvelously. Congratulations. It's just not very practical for, living in. The damp will get into the stonework eventually. You'll have a terrible problem with mildew. But truly, the aesthetic commitment is admirable. He ignored her. It was time for the part of the plan he actually enjoyed, the negotiation. The delicate dance of threats and demands that would see his coffers swell and his power solidified. He picked up the secure comms unit, a heavy black device that crackled with contained energy. He keyed in the private frequency for the Valerius estate. "Your father, Lord Valerius, is a man who values his assets," Theron stated, more to himself than to her. "His reputation, his lineage, you are the key to both." "Oh, you think so?" Rosalind asked, looking genuinely amused. "You're in for a fascinating phone call." The device chirped. 2 voices answered simultaneously. "Valerius?" "Hello? Who is this? Is someone there?" Theron let a low, dangerous chuckle rumble in his chest. It was a well-rehearsed sound. "Lord Valerius, Lady Valerius, I am in possession of something you hold dear." "Oh gods," Lady Valerius gasped. "Is it Rosalind? Please, is she alive? Is she hurt? Tell me she's not. Please tell me." "Darling," Lord Valerius cut in, his tone sharp with irritation. "Let me handle this. Hysterics won't help." "Your daughter is safe," Theron pressed. "For now. Her continued well-being will require a tribute of 5 million standard units." "5 million?" Lady Valerius cried. Yes, we'll pay it. We'll pay anything. Marcus, tell him we'll pay. Marcus, now!" "Eleanor, be reasonable," Lord Valerius said, maddeningly calm. 5 million for a daughter who has systematically destroyed every advantageous match I've arranged? Who has made us a laughingstock in society? "She's our daughter, Marcus!" "She is a liability. You coddle her, Eleanor. You always have." Theron's carefully constructed script began to fray at the edges. "She is your only heir," he said, his voice tight. "A small price to pay for the continuation of your noble line." There was a dreadful silence. Theron could hear the faint clink of ice in a glass and the muffled sound of Lady Valerius weeping. "Tell you what," Lord Valerius said finally, his tone brightening considerably. "You can keep her." Theron stared at the comms unit. He felt a sensation entirely foreign to him, utter blank confusion. What?" "Keep her," the Lord repeated, a note of genuine relief in his voice. "Consider it a gift. A finder's fee, if you will, for taking her off my hands. No charge." "Marcus, no!" Lady Valerius screamed in the background. "What are you saying? She's our baby, she's—" "Eleanor, compose yourself. This is unseemly." "You are refusing to pay the ransom for your own daughter?" Theron asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Refusing? My dear man, I'm thanking you. Do you have any idea what my life has been like for the past decade?" "She's opinionated." From her chair, Rosalind had gone very still. Her face was pale, but her expression was carefully neutral. Only her hands, gripping the arms of the chair, betrayed her. "She's 26 and unmarried," her father lamented, a fact she seems to take a perverse pride in. "She has personally, and with great theatricality, insulted and driven away seven of the most eligible suitors on the continent. One of them she reduced to tears by critiquing his cravat. The cravat! She called it a flaccid confection of sartorial despair. Who says that? Theron glanced at Rosalind. She gave him a small, apologetic shrug, but her eyes had gone bright and glassy. She argues with everyone about everything, Lord Valerius continued, now fully into his tirade. Politics, art, horticulture. She tried to unionize the kitchen staff last winter. Last month at a dinner party, she spent 40 minutes explaining to Ambassador Rothwick why his trade policy was fiscally irresponsible. We lost a very important treaty. Of course, when discussions happen in the proper setting, in my study, with the right people, these observations have merit. But at a dinner table? From her? Shrill, unbecoming, embarrassing. Please, Marcus, Lady Valerius sobbed. I'm begging you. I'll use my own money, my inheritance. Which is under my control, as you well know, Lord Valerius snapped. Eleanor, enough. This is for the best. You have not kidnapped my daughter, sir. You have solved a problem that has plagued me for years. I am in your debt. Good luck. You'll need it. Theron stood in the echoing silence of his throne room, the comms unit humming in his hand. His men, positioned by the doors, were staring at him, their usual stoic terror replaced by wide-eyed bewilderment. He felt their collective gaze. He, the Shadow King, had just been gifted a hostage. He didn't even let her speak, Rosalind whispered, staring at nothing. She wanted me back. She wanted me. Her hands were trembling now. She pressed them together, hard, trying to still them. Well, she said, her voice bright and brittle as glass. That was about how I expected it to go. The ratios, I mean. Mother's love versus father's disappointment. I'd calculated 70-30. Turns out it's more like 95-5. At least now I have data. Theron felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest. Not pity, precisely, but something uncomfortably close to it. He raised the comms unit again, his thumb hovering over the redial key. This was a bluff, a negotiating tactic. Lord Valerius was testing his resolve. A man of his station did not simply abandon his heir. It was unthinkable. He pressed the key. The line connected almost instantly. Valerius, what now? This is not a negotiation, Theron snarled, injecting every ounce of menace he possessed into the words. This is a demand. 5 million units, or you will never see your daughter again. There was another sigh, this one longer and more profound. My good man, are you not listening? That is precisely the outcome I am hoping for. Look, I'll be frank with you, since you seem to be a man of direct action. Rosalind is brilliant, I'll grant you that. But her brilliance is a weapon, and she wields it like a drunken mercenary in a crowded tavern. She doesn't just have opinions, she has theses. Fully cited. With footnotes. On everything. Theron's mind struggled to process the imagery. Footnotes? Last week at a diplomatic dinner, Valerius continued, his voice a low, pained murmur, she cornered the trade ambassador from the Northern Reach and delivered a 45-minute lecture on the structural inefficiencies of their tariff policies. He left in a cold sweat. We lost the treaty. The week before that, she redesigned the entire West Wing garden based on some obscure philosophical principle of botanical honesty. The gardeners are threatening to revolt. The woman is a force of nature, a beautifully packaged, well-educated hurricane. And now, she is your hurricane. My sincerest congratulations on your acquisition. Theron stared into the middle distance. Hurricane. The word seemed apt. He lowered the comms unit and placed it on a nearby table with a heavy, final thud. The sound echoed in the cavernous room, a punctuation mark on the most baffling failure of his career. He was the Shadow King. He trafficked in secrets, in fear, in violence. He did not traffic in unwanted, overly articulate daughters of the aristocracy. What was the protocol here? There was no chapter in his mental handbook for this. Chapter 17, when the ransom target is rejected by the payer. It simply didn't exist. Should he just let her go? Drive her back to her father's gates and leave her on the doorstep like a misdelivered parcel? The thought was humiliating. He turned his gaze back to Rosalind. She had managed, through a series of subtle wiggles, to get her hands free of the poorly tied ropes. She was now rubbing her wrists, her expression carefully composed, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept swallowing. "Well," she said, breaking the stunned silence, That was about how I expected it to go. My father is a pragmatist. I am, from his perspective, a non-performing asset with high maintenance costs. Giving me to you is, in his ledger, a net gain." She stood up, brushing imagined dust from her dress, her movements a little too brisk, a little too controlled. "He's not a bad man. He's just a terrible father. There's a difference. And my mother? She loves me. She's not allowed to act on it." She walked a slow circle around the center of the room, her footsteps clicking on the cold stone. She was no longer a captive. She was something else now, something unclassifiable and dangerous. She was a problem without a solution. "So," she said, stopping and facing him directly, "you find yourself in a predicament. You have a hostage nobody wants, your time has been wasted, and your reputation for terrifying efficiency has just taken a rather public hit with your own staff." She gestured with her chin toward Kale and the other guard, who were trying very hard to look like inanimate parts of the wall. This is not a good look for the fearsome Shadow King. Theron's eyes narrowed. "You will not speak my title." "Why not?" she countered, unfazed. "It's a bit melodramatic, but it has a certain flair. The point is, your operation is a bust. But my situation has also changed. I cannot go back home. My father has, in essence, disowned me, in the most creatively insulting way imaginable. So it seems to me that we have a convergence of needs." He waited, a dark and silent statue of fury and confusion. "You need to recover your losses and reassert your authority," she began, ticking points off on her fingers. For the moment, I need shelter. A place to stay while I figure out my next move. A temporary arrangement, nothing permanent, just until I can sort myself out." "And what," Theron asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "could you possibly offer me in exchange for my hospitality?" Rosalind smiled. It was the first real smile he had seen from her, and it was sharp and brilliant and utterly unnerving. "My father thinks I'm a liability because I have opinions. He's wrong. I'm a liability because I have information. Decades of it." Theron felt a flicker of interest, an emotion he quickly suppressed. "Go on." "My father, Lord Valerius, is not just a lord," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush that was somehow perfectly audible in the acoustically flawed room. "He is the clean face of a very dirty enterprise. He launders money for half the corrupt syndicates in the capital. He facilitates illegal arms shipments to the Eastern warlords. He has a network of bribed officials, judges, and city watch captains that would make your head spin. He keeps meticulous records of all of it because he's an arrogant fool who believes he's untouchable." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the cold air. "I know where he keeps those records," she said softly. "I know the routes of his shipments. I know the names of the men on his payroll. I know all the dirty little secrets that hold his legitimate empire together. I was the one who organized his files last summer. He complained about my system, of course, called it unnecessarily complex. My presence at family dinners was distracting. But the information? That stayed in my head." Theron was very still. What she was offering was not a paltry ransom. It was a key to unlocking the entire power structure of the city, a structure that had long considered him a necessary evil to be contained in the Undercity, but never a true peer. With that information, he could not just profit, he could dominate. "You would betray your own father?" he asked, testing her. She met his gaze without flinching. "He just gifted me to a kidnapper," she retorted without hesitation. "He chose his pride over my life. He silenced my mother's pleas. I believe that nullifies any filial obligation I might have had. Besides, I don't see it as betrayal. I see it as a severance package, and perhaps a small measure of justice for every time he made me feel worthless." The audacity of it was breathtaking. She stood there, a disowned noblewoman in the heart of her kidnapper's fortress, not pleading for her life, but negotiating a business deal. "The terms," she stated, her voice all business now. "You provide me with a room, food, and a guarantee of my personal safety. You will not harm me or treat me as a prisoner. In exchange, I will provide you with actionable intelligence on my father's operations. One secret for every week of my stay. We do this until I have found suitable alternative arrangements, at which point our contract is concluded and we go our separate ways. Strictly business, nothing more." He looked at her, at the unwavering intelligence in her green eyes, at the way she held herself together despite the tremor in her hands she couldn't quite hide. She was a hurricane, just as her father had said. But perhaps a hurricane was precisely what he needed to flatten the stagnant, corrupt landscape of the city above. A hurricane he could, with care, direct. It was a risk. She was volatile, unpredictable. But the potential reward was a kingdom. "Agreed," Theron said. The word felt heavy, momentous. Rosalind nodded, a crisp, satisfied gesture. "Excellent. Now about my room. I prefer something with southern exposure, if possible, and I'll need access to your library, if you have one. Most fortresses of doom tend to skimp on the reading material." Theron just stared at her. His flawless, failed kidnapping had just become the strangest business acquisition of his life. The first few days of the arrangement were a study in strained silence. Theron installed her in a suite of rooms in the West Tower, far from his own quarters. They were comfortable, even luxurious by undercity standards, and yes, they had southern exposure, a fact he found himself annoyed to have accommodated. He instructed his household staff to see to her needs, and he tried, for the most part, to forget she was there. This proved to be impossible. Her presence was a subtle but persistent disruption to the grim, orderly rhythm of his life. He would catch a glimpse of her walking in the bleak courtyard garden, her bright dress a slash of color against the gray stone. He would hear the distant sound of her voice, clear and precise, asking the cook a series of alarmingly detailed questions about spice origins and fair wages. One afternoon, he saw her sitting in the kitchen courtyard with Mara, the head cook's young daughter, teaching her to read from a battered old book. The child's delighted laughter echoed through the stone corridors, a sound the onyx spire had never heard before. Rosalind looked up, caught his gaze from across the courtyard, and gave him a small, slightly embarrassed smile, as if she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. He turned away, unsettled by the warmth that had bloomed in his chest. He also noticed how his staff had begun to change around her. Old Marin, the cook, who had worked in silence for 20 years, now hummed while she prepared meals. The guard stood a little straighter when Rosalind passed, not out of fear, but something closer to respect. Even Cale, whose face seemed permanently set in a scowl, had been seen actually smiling after she'd asked his opinion on a security matter and then genuinely listened to his answer. It was unsettling. The fortress felt different, lighter somehow. Their business was conducted with brisk formality. Once a week, they met in his study. She would present him with a piece of information, the name of a bribed Port Authority official, the schedule of an illicit cargo freighter, the location of a hidden ledger. She would explain its significance with the clarity of a university lecturer, and he would listen, his mind racing with the strategic implications. The information was always impeccable. Within 2 weeks, he had disrupted a rival's smuggling operation and leveraged a city councilman into his pocket. His lieutenants were awestruck. They credited it to his own genius, and he did not correct them. He told himself he was satisfied. The deal was profitable, but a strange undercurrent of irritation followed him throughout the day. It was a low-grade hum of annoyance that he couldn't quite place. The source of the hum became clear on the 15th day of her residence. He was in his study, a cavernous room paneled in dark wood, trying to locate a specific volume, the strategic topography of the sunken districts, a rare text essential for planning a new network of smuggling tunnels. He knew exactly where it should be, 3rd shelf from the top, 7th book from the left, a position it had occupied for 20 years. It wasn't there. A cold knot of anger formed in his stomach. His systems were perfect. His order was absolute. Nothing in his fortress was ever misplaced. He stalked out of the study and down the hall to the library, his boots echoing with grim purpose. The library was his sanctuary, 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with everything from ancient histories to modern economic theory. It was silent, dusty, and ordered according to a system of his own devising, chronologically, by date of acquisition. It was the history of his own ascent, written in the spines of books. He threw open the heavy oak doors and stopped dead. The library was not silent. It was not still. It was in a state of utter, catastrophic chaos. Books were everywhere, not just on shelves, but in towering, precarious stacks on the floor. They covered every table, every chair. The air, usually thick with the scent of old paper and leather, was hazed with dust motes dancing in the beams of light from the high windows. And in the center of it all, perched atop a rolling ladder, was Rosalind. She had a smudge of dirt on her cheek, her hair was escaping its pins in a dozen different directions, and she looked utterly, infuriatingly content. She was humming, slightly off-key. "What?" Theron said, his voice a low growl that vibrated with barely contained rage. "Is the meaning of this?" She looked down at him, shielding her eyes from the light. "Oh, hello. I'm reorganizing. Don't worry, I'll have it all sorted in a week or 2. It's actually quite fascinating, your collection. You have a first edition of Marlowe's Treatise on Urban Warfare sitting next to a cookbook from the 3rd century. It's wonderfully chaotic." "Reorganizing," he repeated, the word tasting like poison. "You are destroying my library." "Don't be so dramatic," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "I'm improving it. Your current system is, and I say this with all due respect, absolute madness. My system is chronological." "Exactly," she exclaimed, as if he'd just proven her point. "It's chronological by acquisition date, which is the organizational system of a magpie with a head injury." "There's no logic to it. A treatise on agricultural yields from the 3rd century is sitting next to a manual on modern explosives. How does anyone find anything?" "I find things," he hissed. "I knew where every single book in this library was." "You knew because you've memorized the illogical placement of thousands of objects through sheer force of will," she countered, climbing down the ladder. "That's not a system. It's a burden. I'm implementing a proper one. Thematic categorization with cross-referencing by author, subject, and historical period. It will be a marvel of efficiency. And truly, you'll thank me." She gestured proudly at a table piled high with books, where she'd laid out a series of handwritten placards: military history, economic theory, forbidden arcana, poorly written poetry. He stared at the placard for poorly written poetry. He had, in a moment of weakness decades ago, acquired a volume by a lovelorn duke. To see it so brutally categorized felt like a personal attack. "You did not have my permission," he said, the words cold and hard as iron. "I didn't think I'd get it if I asked," she replied breezily. "It falls under the general heading of improving my living conditions. A functional library is a basic requirement for any civilized person. By the way," she added, picking up a familiar-looking tome with a worn leather cover, "is this what you were looking for? The strategic topography of the sunken districts. I've put it with the other cartographical texts. See? So much more intuitive." She held it out to him. He snatched it from her hand, his knuckles brushing hers. A strange, unexpected jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. He recoiled slightly. He stood there, clutching the book, his rage warring with a deeply unsettling sense of correctness. She was right. His system was absurd. He knew it, on some level. He had just never admitted it. Because it was his. It was the one part of his world that was built on his history, not cold logic. And she had dismantled it without a moment's hesitation. He should have thrown her out. He should have dragged her back to her room and barred the door. He should have unleashed the full, terrifying force of his anger upon her. He did none of those things. He looked at the chaos she had created, at the dust she had disturbed. The library, for the first time in years, felt alive. It felt like someone else was actually living in his fortress, not just existing within its walls. "Do not," he said, his voice tight, "touch the cartography section again. I will organize that myself. And ask before you dismantle any other part of my home." She smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Of course. I can respect that." He turned on his heel and walked out, the book clutched in his hand. He didn't stop her. He complained, he set a boundary, but he didn't stop her. And as he walked back to his silent, orderly study, he couldn't escape the horrifying realization that he was, in some small, secret part of himself, looking forward to seeing how it turned out. The hum of irritation was still there, but now it was joined by a new, more dangerous frequency: curiosity. The library incident marked a subtle shift in their dynamic. Theron found himself making excuses to walk past its open doors, observing the methodical progress of her work. The chaotic piles slowly resolved themselves into neat, logical sections. She worked with a fierce, focused energy that he grudgingly began to respect. She was not merely tidying, she was building something better. This unnerving competence bled into other areas of his life. A week after the library debacle, Theron convened a meeting with his top lieutenants in the war room. The issue at hand was a rival, Silas the Serpent Vane, who had begun encroaching on Theron's territory in the northern warehouse district. His lieutenants, Cale, the scarred brute, Malachi, a wiry creature of the shadows, and Gregor, a former financier whose heart was as cold as his coin, offered their usual brand of counsel. "We hit him hard," Cale grunted, slamming a meaty fist on the large oak table. "Burn his warehouses. Send a message. Let them know what happens when they cross the Shadow King." "Too crude," Malachi hissed from his corner. "An assassin, clean, untraceable. We make him a ghost. No one will even know we were involved." "Unprofitable," Gregor droned, not looking up from his abacus. "Violence disrupts trade. We should initiate a price war on smuggled goods. Undercut him. Bankrupt him. It's a slower approach, but it's cleaner." Theron listened, his expression a mask of stone. These were the pillars of his empire: brute force, quiet death, and avarice. They were effective tools, but they were hammers, and not every problem was a nail. This situation with Vane required a scalpel. From a small desk in the corner of the room, where she had been tasked with transcribing the meeting's minutes, her idea, she'd claimed, to better understand the corporate culture, came a small, distinct sound. A scoff. It was not loud, but in the tense silence of the war room, it was like a thunderclap. Every head turned. Theron felt a hot flush of fury creep up his neck. He had allowed her in this room on the strict condition of her absolute silence. Rosalind was looking down at her notepad, a pen held loosely in her fingers. The corner of her mouth was quirked in an expression of profound intellectual disdain. Theron's gaze was glacial. "Do you have something to add, Lady Rosalind?" His lieutenants stared, mouths agape. Their king, consulting the worthless hostage? Rosalind looked up, her green eyes sweeping over the three men with undisguised pity. "My apologies, my lord. It was an involuntary reaction to a collection of approaches that, while traditional, might benefit from a fresh perspective." Cale bristled. "Fresh perspective?" "May I?" she asked, and at Theron's curt nod, she continued. Your proposals are burn everything, which brings unwanted attention from the city watch, assassinate him, which creates a power vacuum others will fight over, or start a price war that damages your margins as much as his. All viable in their own way, but perhaps not the most elegant solutions available. The three lieutenants exchanged uneasy glances. Phrased like that, their plans did sound rather simplistic. And what would you suggest, my lady? Malachi sneered. A firmly worded letter? Perhaps we ask him politely to leave? No, Rosalind said, her voice sharp and clear. Subterfuge. May I? She stood and walked to the large map of the Undercity that dominated one wall. She tapped a finger on the northern warehouse district. Silas Vane's primary income isn't from smuggled goods. It's from providing security to the merchants in that district. He's running a protection racket. His reputation is built on the belief that he can keep the merchants safe. That's his value proposition. You don't attack Vane directly, you attack that belief. She turned back to face the stunned room. I have contacts, people who owe me favors. A guild of master locksmiths, to be precise. For a reasonable fee, they could, over the course of one night, disable the locks on every warehouse Vane protects. Not break them, mind you, just render them inoperable. Simultaneously, you use your own network to acquire a few minor, easily replaceable shipments from those same warehouses. Nothing valuable enough to start a war, just enough to cause a panic. By morning, Vane's clients will find their warehouses breached and their goods missing. Their invincible protector will look incompetent. His reputation will be shattered. They will drop him and come flocking to you for real security. You take over his entire territory without firing a single shot or losing a single unit of profit. In fact, you'll have a whole new client base paying you for the privilege. It's elegant, it's bloodless, and it's profitable. Silence. Theron stared at the map, his mind rapidly processing her strategy. It was elegant. It was insidious. It was brilliant. It attacked the foundation of his rival's power, not the man himself. It was a move he had never considered. Gregor was the first to speak, his voice a reedy whisper of awe. The profit margins would be exceptional. Cale grunted, a sound that, for him, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. No blood. Smart. Very smart. Malachi simply nodded, his shadowy form seeming to shrink back in deference. The lady has a point. A strong one. Theron looked at Rosalind, who was watching him with a calm, expectant expression. She had, in the space of 2 minutes, utterly humiliated his most trusted advisors and handed him a perfect, bloodless victory. The fury he had felt moments before had evaporated, replaced by a cold, thrilling shock of recognition. He was a master strategist, but his strategies were born of the darkness he inhabited. Hers were from another world, a world of ledgers and loopholes and the subtle leverage of perception. Dismissed, he said to his lieutenants. They scrambled out of the room, casting backward glances of awe and fear at Rosalind. When they were alone, Theron walked to the map. He traced the outline of the district she had indicated. The Locksmiths Guild, he said. How do you propose we contact them? Oh, I already have, she said, pulling a small, folded piece of paper from her sleeve. I sent a message this morning. They're awaiting your confirmation. I took the liberty of negotiating their fee down by 15%. They were asking for a ridiculous sum. I hope that was acceptable. I didn't want to overstep. He took the paper from her. His hand was steady, but his world was tilting on its axis. He had brought her here as a pawn in a simple game of extortion. He had kept her as an informant. But that was no longer what she was. She was not a piece on the board. She was a player. From now on, he said, his back still to her, you will attend all of my strategic meetings. Of course, she replied, her voice smooth as silk. Will I still be required to take the minutes? He could hear the smile in her voice. He did not turn around. No, he said, a strange, unfamiliar lightness in his own tone. You will be required to run them. The weeks that followed settled into a new, startling rhythm. Rosalind was no longer a houseguest or an informant, she was an integral part of his operation. His war room, once a den of grim pronouncements and brutish plans, became a forum for sharp debate. She challenged his assumptions, dismantled his lieutenant's half-baked ideas with surgical precision, and proposed strategies of such elegant complexity that they left him breathless. His empire flourished, profits soared. Territories expanded not through bloodshed, but through clever contracts, exploited loopholes, and the masterful manipulation of public perception, all concepts she had introduced. His men, initially suspicious, began to treat her with a grudging, fearful respect. They called her the Lady, and they spoke the title with the same hushed reverence they used for his own. But it was more than just respect born of fear. Theron began to notice small changes. Cale, who had initially been humiliated by her critique, now sought her counsel before proposing strategies. She never made him feel foolish. Instead, she would say things like, "That's a solid foundation, Cale. What if we built on it by adding this element?" And Cale would beam with pride, as if the refined strategy had been his idea all along. Malachi, who dealt in shadows and silence, found in her someone who appreciated subtlety. And Gregor discovered that her mathematical mind could calculate profit margins faster than his abacus. The men didn't just fear her, they were beginning to admire her. And so, Theron realized with growing unease, was he. Their dinners became the center of his day. The long, imposing dining table, which had for years seated only him in echoing solitude, now felt strangely intimate. The cavernous room was still cold, but the air crackled with their conversation. It was rarely personal. They spoke of politics, of strategy, of history. They argued, they debated. They dissected the world like a complex piece of machinery. She mocked his taste in art, calling the grim, battle-scarred landscapes that adorned his walls the visual equivalent of a migraine. "Honestly, Theron," she said one evening, gesturing at a particularly bleak painting of a massacre, "who looks at this over breakfast and thinks, 'Yes, this really sets the mood for my porridge'?" He, in turn, criticized her habit of humming slightly off-key when she was thinking, a sound he claimed could curdle milk at 20 paces. "It helps me concentrate," she'd argued, looking genuinely offended. "It helps my teeth ache," he'd retorted. But he found, to his profound dismay, that he missed the sound when she wasn't there. The silence of his fortress had once been a comfort, a symbol of his control. Now it felt empty, lacking. He had grown accustomed to the color she brought to his gray world, the sharp, brilliant energy of her mind. One evening, during dinner, she told him a story. It was about her childhood, about how she'd once corrected a visiting diplomat's mathematics during a state dinner when she was 12. The table had gone silent. "My father was mortified," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "He sent me to my room without supper, told me I'd embarrassed him." But the diplomat's calculation was wrong, and his error would have cost our country a fortune in trade. My father's advisor quietly used my correction in the negotiations the next day. No one ever acknowledged it. Theron had set down his fork, watching her. "That was brilliant," he said quietly. "Not embarrassing. Brilliant." She'd looked up at him, surprised. Her father should have been proud. "Thank you," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. That means more than you know." One evening he found her in the newly organized library, curled in a large armchair by the fire, a heavy tome open in her lap. The firelight softened the sharp angles of her face, turning her green eyes to molten gold. She was reading a book of ancient poetry, not from the poorly written section, he noted with some relief. She was so absorbed she didn't hear him approach. He stopped in the doorway, watching her. In this quiet moment, stripped of their usual armor of wit and strategy, she looked peaceful, vulnerable. a feeling he had never before associated with her. A strange, protective fondness stirred in his chest. It was an unwelcome, unsettling sensation, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. He felt an absurd urge to put a blanket over her, to ensure the fire didn't die down. The thought was so alien, so contrary to his very nature, that he turned and walked away before she could see him. That night he lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness, troubled by the realization that his strictly business arrangement had become something else entirely. The lines had blurred, and he no longer knew where the contract ended and the man began. She was more than an advisor. She was a companion. The only one he had ever had. 2 months to the day after her arrival, she came to dinner looking different. There was a brightness in her eyes, a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with a successful strategy or a well-argued point. She was wearing a simple but elegant dress he hadn't seen before. "You look pleased," he observed, pouring them both a glass of the dark red wine she favored. "I am," she said, her smile genuine and wide. "I had a productive day. I've secured an apartment." Theron froze, the decanter hovering over his glass. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy and cold. An apartment. "In the university district," she continued, oblivious to the sudden chill that had descended upon him. "It's small, but it has excellent light and is surprisingly quiet. I've been using some of the consulting fees you've been so generously providing to make a down payment." The landlord was surprisingly reasonable once I explained my references. Well, I didn't mention you specifically, of course, but I implied I had powerful connections. He had insisted on paying her a salary for her work, a formality to maintain the pretense of their business arrangement. He had never imagined she would use it to leave. "Our deal is concluded, Theron," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've given you enough information to dismantle my father's network and establish your own dominance for years to come. I've helped you streamline your operations. The contract is fulfilled. I'll be moving my things at the end of the week. It's time. I can't stay here forever as your consultant. I need to build my own life." He set the decanter down with a click that sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. The food on his plate, a roasted fowl that his chef had spent all day preparing, suddenly looked like ash and bone. He picked up his fork, the metal cold and heavy in his hand. "I see," he said. His voice was a flat, dead thing. The easy camaraderie of moments before had vanished, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable tension. The vast space between them at the table felt like a chasm. He searched for something to say, a strategic countermove, a new negotiation. But his mind, usually a whirlwind of plots and contingencies, was utterly blank. She was leaving. The thought was a physical blow. She was going to pack her few belongings and walk out of his fortress, out of his life, and back into a world that had nothing to do with him. The library would be silent again. The war room would revert to a cave of grunting Neanderthals. His dinners would be solitary affairs, punctuated only by the echo of his own fork against the plate. The life he had known before her, a life of absolute power and profound loneliness, rushed back to greet him, and he found he could no longer bear the thought of it. "That is good news," he managed to say, the lie tasting like acid. "You have found your independence." "Thanks to you," she said, raising her glass. "It's the strangest thing. You kidnapped me to hold me captive, and in doing so, you've given me my freedom. I'll always be grateful for that. Truly. You've been kinder to me than I had any right to expect." He could not meet her toast. He stared down at his plate, the meticulously arranged food blurring before his eyes. The deal was done. He had won. He had gotten everything he wanted and more. So why did it feel like he was losing everything that mattered? They finished the meal in near silence, the clink of silverware against porcelain the only sound. She tried, once or twice, to restart the conversation, asking him about a pending negotiation, commenting on the wine, but his monosyllabic responses killed each attempt. When she finally excused herself, her face troubled and confused, he sat alone at the long table, staring at her empty chair, feeling more alone than he had in his entire life. That night, sleep was a distant country he could not reach. Theron paced the cold stone corridors of his fortress, a ghost in his own home. The silence was a physical weight pressing in on him. Every echo of his footsteps mocked him, a lonely sound in a vast, empty space. He had built this empire to insulate himself, to create a world where he was in complete control, where no one could touch him. He had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He was untouchable, and he had never felt more alone. His restless wandering led him, inevitably, to the library. He pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside. The moonlight streamed through the high windows, silvering the spines of thousands of books. It was perfect, orderly. Every volume was in its correct, logical place. He could walk to any shelf and retrieve any piece of knowledge he desired within seconds. He hated it. He ran a hand along a shelf labeled Classical Philosophy. The books were cool and smooth beneath his fingers. It was a flawless system, a monument to her intelligence and clarity of thought. But the life had gone out of it. The joyous, creative chaos of her work was gone, replaced by this sterile perfection. The organization wasn't the point. He saw that now with a clarity that was agonizing. The point was her, covered in dust, humming off-key, her mind alight with the challenge of bringing order to his world. The point was the process, not the result. He sank into the armchair by the cold hearth, the one she always sat in. The leather still held the faint, pleasant scent of old paper and her, a subtle fragrance he hadn't consciously noticed until this moment, when he was faced with its imminent absence. He had told himself their arrangement was business. It was a lie, a convenient fiction to mask a terrifying truth. He hadn't been housing an informant. He had been living with a partner. He hadn't been listening to an advisor. He had been talking with a friend, the only one he had. He had built his entire life on the principle of leverage, of using others' weaknesses to his advantage. He had taken her in because she was a tool, a key to unlock his ambitions. But somewhere along the way, the tool had remade the man who wielded it. She had broken into the locked fortress of his life, not with force, but with intelligence, wit, and an infuriating refusal to be intimidated by him. She had reorganized his library, his strategies, his entire world. And now she was going to leave, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she would take all the color and light with her, leaving him alone in the gray, orderly silence he had once craved. The Shadow King, master of the Undercity, was afraid. He was terrified of the quiet. He was terrified of the emptiness. He was terrified of a future that did not have her in it. He sat in the dark for hours, the moon tracing its slow path across the sky. For the first time in his adult life, Theron did not have a plan. He only had a devastating, hollow ache in his chest where his cold, calculating heart used to be. He had to do something. But what? Forbid her to leave? That would make him a jailer again, and her a prisoner. It would destroy the very thing he had come to value, the fierce, voluntary engagement of her mind with his. He could not command her to stay. He would have to ask. And that was a more terrifying prospect than facing down any rival. The day came, the end of the week. He watched from his window as a small electric cart from the upper city pulled into his courtyard. Her bags, a surprisingly small collection, were already standing by the main doors. He had spent the past 3 days in a state of suspended panic, the words he needed to say churning in his mind, always rearranging themselves into the wrong order. He descended the grand staircase, his steps measured, his face an emotionless mask he had worn for so long it felt like his own skin. She was standing in the great hall, pulling on a pair of gloves. She looked up as he approached, a small, slightly sad smile on her face. "Well," she said softly, "this is it." "It would appear so," he replied, his voice betrayerously hoarse. He cleared his throat. "The contract is concluded." "It is," she agreed. "Thank you, Theron, for everything. For giving me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. For valuing my mind when no one else did. For treating me like I mattered. I'll never forget that." She turned to leave. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. It was now or never. "Wait!" The word was quiet, but it stopped her cold. She turned back, her expression questioning. This was it, the moment of truth. He straightened his shoulders, drawing on a lifetime of command and authority, hoping it would be enough to conceal the raw terror underneath. "I wish to renegotiate the terms of our agreement," he said. The words sounded stiff and formal, even to his own ears. Rosalind's brow furrowed in confusion. "Renegotiate? But the deal is done. I have nothing left to offer you. You have all my father's secrets. What could you possibly want from me now?" "That is not the resource I am interested in acquiring," he said, taking a step closer. The space between them crackled with unspoken things. "I have a new proposal, a new set of terms." She watched him, her head tilted, her green eyes searching his face. The witty retort, the sarcastic quip he had come to expect, did not come. She was listening. He took a breath, the cold air of the hall feeling thin in his lungs. "Term 1. Permanent residence. The West Tower suite is yours, for as long as you wish it. Not as a guest, not as compensation. Just yours." Her eyes widened slightly. "Term 2, he continued, his voice growing stronger, more certain. "Unrestricted, unconditional access to the library. You may reorganize it, annotate it, even burn the poetry sections if you so choose. It is yours to command. Though I would prefer you didn't burn anything. The poetry is terrible, but it's mine." A flicker of amusement danced in her gaze, but she remained silent. Term 3. Dinner. Every evening. At the main table. Your presence is requested. Required. I find the silence unbearable without your voice to fill it, without your terrible humming, without you telling me my art is depressing and my throne is a monstrosity. He took another step. They were only a few feet apart now. He could see the faint, surprised parting of her lips, the way her breath had quickened. Term 4, he said, his voice dropping lower, losing its formal edge and becoming something more raw, more real. Your opinion. On everything. Strategy, politics, art, the questionable competency of my lieutenants, the way I take my coffee. I require it, solicited or not, forever. Because you see the world in ways I never could. You've made me better, sharper, less alone. He stopped, his list of terms exhausted. He had laid his cards on the table. He had offered her everything he had, not of his kingdom, but of himself. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He had built a fortress of stone and fear, and she had breached its walls without a single weapon. Now he was willingly handing her the keys to the citadel. She stared at him for a long moment, her sharp, analytical gaze seeing past the Shadow King, past the strategist, to the lonely man standing before her. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet and laced with a dawning, incredulous wonder. "Theron," she said slowly, "that sounds suspiciously like a marriage proposal." His heart hammered against his ribs. The mask was gone. The king was gone. There was only him, exposed and vulnerable. He had planned for every contingency but this, the simple, terrifying act of naming the thing he wanted. He met her gaze, his own dark eyes holding a truth he could no longer hide. Only, he said. The word a quiet admission, a final surrender, if you wanted it to be. I'm not good at this. At feelings. At asking for things I want instead of taking them. But I'm asking now. Stay. Not because of the contract, not because of strategy. Stay because I don't want to face another day without you in it. Because this fortress, this empire, this entire life I've built, it's all empty without you. There it was, the ultimate vulnerability, laid bare in the echoing hall. He had offered her a contract, a partnership, a life. But he was leaving the final, most important clause for her to write. Rosalind's expression softened. The calculating gleam in her eyes melted away, replaced by a warmth that was more stunning than any of her brilliant strategies. Her own eyes were suddenly bright with unshed tears. Do you mean that? She asked, her voice trembling. Because my father spent my entire life making me feel like I was too much, too opinionated, too difficult, too everything. He made me feel like my mind was a burden, not a gift. And you're standing here telling me that you want all of that? That you want me? He closed the remaining distance between them in one step, his hands coming up to gently cup her face. I don't want less of you, Rosalind, he said fiercely. I want more. I want every sharp word, every brilliant strategy, every off-key hum. I want the woman who reorganized my library and my entire life without asking permission. I want the woman who humiliated my lieutenants and made them better for it. I want the woman who teaches cook's daughters to read and makes hardened criminals smile. I want you. All of you. Always. A tear spilled down her cheek, and she laughed, a sound that was half sob, half joy. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, transforming her features, making her more beautiful than any woman he had ever known. She took a step toward him, closing the last of the distance between them, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. Well, she said, her voice laced with the familiar, beloved wit that was hers alone. If I'm to be a permanent resident, the tapestries in the dining hall will have to go. They are offensively maudlin. I can't look at all that bloodshed every morning. It's bad for digestion. Relief, so potent and overwhelming it almost brought him to his knees, washed through him. It was not a yes in the traditional sense. It was better. It was a yes in their language, a negotiation, a starting point for the rest of their lives. A slow smile, a true and unfamiliar feeling on his own face, touched his lips. I am open to discussion on the matter of the tapestries. And the throne, she added, her eyes sparkling with mischief even through her tears. It's a monstrosity, far too much obsidian. It makes you look like you're auditioning to be the villain in a cheap opera. No one can take you seriously when you're sitting on that thing. It is a symbol of my power, he protested, though the words had no heat. It's a decorating nightmare, she corrected gently. She reached out and straightened the collar of his tunic, her touch sending a jolt of warmth through him that had nothing to do with static electricity. We'll find something more tasteful. Something that says benevolent autocrat with impeccable style, not brooding villain with joint problems. You're too young for back pain. He looked down at her, at this impossible, infuriating, brilliant woman who had taken his cold, orderly world and turned it into a home. The Shadow King had kidnapped a hostage and ended up being the one who was well and truly captured. I accept your terms, he said, his voice soft. All of them, even the throne. You can replace it with a cushioned armchair for all I care, as long as you're here. Good, Rosalind said, her smile widening. Now, about my title. Queen is so terribly stuffy, don't you think? I was thinking something more along the lines of Chief Executive of Domestic and Strategic Affairs. It has a nice ring to it, very official, very businesslike. Theron laughed, a real, actual laugh. The sound echoed through the great hall, bright and alive, chasing away the last of the shadows. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers, his thumb gently wiping away the tears on her cheeks. "You can call yourself whatever you want," he whispered, "as long as you stay, as long as you're mine, as long as I'm yours." "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered back. "I'm home." For the first time, the onyx spire did not feel like a fortress at all. It felt like a beginning. And then, because words had been said and contracts had been made, and there was nothing left to negotiate, Theron kissed her. It was tentative at first, a question, and she answered with a fierce certainty that sent warmth flooding through every cold corner of his being. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, she was smiling up at him with such unguarded happiness that his heart, that organ he'd thought long dead, seemed to stutter back to life. "So," she said, her voice light, "when should we tell your lieutenants that the hurricane is here to stay? That I'm not just a consultant anymore, but, well, whatever this is." Theron groaned. "Cale is going to have an aneurysm. Malachi will probably assume I've been enchanted. Gregor will want to renegotiate everyone's contracts." "Good," Rosalind said, laughing. "They could all use a little excitement in their lives. Besides, I have some ideas about restructuring the entire operation that I've been dying to share." Cale's tactical approach could use some refinement, and Gregor's accounting system is, well, it's functional, but it could be so much more efficient. Theron looked down at her, at the mischievous glint in her green eyes, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Peace. Joy. Home. "You're going to terrify them, aren't you?" he asked. "Absolutely," she confirmed, "but in the best possible way. They'll thank me, eventually. Probably. Maybe. Well, Gregor might, at least." And it was. In the months that followed, the onyx spire transformed. The tapestries came down, replaced by art that didn't induce existential despair. The throne was, after much heated negotiation and several extremely detailed proposals from Rosalind, complete with sketches and cost-benefit analyses, replaced with something that she deemed less likely to cause spinal damage and more likely to make visiting diplomats take him seriously. The library became the heart of the fortress, always warm, always welcoming, filled with the sound of her humming and the scratch of his pen as they worked side by side. His lieutenants adjusted, slowly. Cale learned to appreciate Rosalind's strategic brilliance, especially after she helped him negotiate a deal that tripled his personal profit share, and then complimented his instincts in front of the entire war room. Malachi found in her a kindred spirit who appreciated the art of subtlety and could match him in a game of strategy chess. Gregor, ever the pragmatist, simply calculated that her presence increased efficiency by 47% and declared himself satisfied. Though he was heard to mutter that her new filing system was genius, and why hadn't anyone thought of it before? But the greatest transformation was in Theron himself. The Shadow King, who had built his empire on fear and isolation, learned what it meant to build something with someone else, to share not just strategy, but hope. Not just space, but life. Not just power, but partnership. 3 months after she chose to stay, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Lady Rosalind Valerius, in an elegant, feminine hand. Rosalind stared at it for a long moment before opening it, her hands trembling slightly. Theron stood beside her, a silent, steady presence. "My dearest Rosalind," the letter began, "I do not know if this letter will reach you, or if you are even. I pray daily that you are safe, that you are well, that somewhere, somehow, you know that I love you. Your father has forbidden me from speaking of you, from searching for you. He says you are gone and that I must accept it. I cannot. I will not. You were never a disappointment, my darling girl. You were my greatest joy. Your intelligence, your spirit, your refusal to be diminished, these were not flaws. They were gifts. The world called you difficult because you refused to be small. Your father called you opinionated because you dared to be right. I called you brilliant, and I always will. I only wish I had been strong enough to protect you from a world that couldn't see that. If you receive this, know that there is a home waiting for you if you want it. Not your father's house, but mine. I have made arrangements. I am leaving him, Rosalind. It took losing you to find my courage, and I will regret that cowardice for the rest of my life. But I am free now, and I am waiting. With all my love, forever, Mama. Rosalind read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. Theron wrapped his arms around her, holding her as she wept. Not for what she'd lost, but for what she'd found. A mother who loved her, a man who valued her, a place where she belonged. We'll write back, he said quietly. Together. Today.
Right now, if you want.
Thank you, she whispered. That evening they sat at the long dining table, the one that was no longer too big, and composed a response. They told her mother she was safe, that she was happy, that she'd found, against all odds, a home, that she'd found someone who loved every sharp edge and brilliant thought. They invited her to visit if she wished, if she could. They would send a carriage, they would send guards, they would ensure her safety. The letter was sent the next morning, and though it would be months before a reply came, months of careful planning and secret arrangements, it would come. Lady Valerius would step out of a carriage and into the courtyard of the onyx spire, her eyes wide with wonder and trepidation, and Rosalind, standing beside the Shadow King, her partner, her love, would run to her mother's arms and for the first time in years feel completely, utterly whole. But that was a story for another day. For now, in this moment, Theron and Rosalind sat together in the library, the fire crackling softly, surrounded by perfectly organized books and the quiet certainty of a shared future. She was humming again, that slightly off-key melody that he'd once claimed drove him mad. He smiled, reaching out to take her hand. "Don't stop," he said softly. She looked up at him, surprised. "I thought it curdled milk, that it was the auditory equivalent of torture." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "It does," he said, "but I'd rather live in a world with sour milk and your terrible humming than in perfect silence without you. I'd rather have chaos and color than order and emptiness. I'd rather have you." She laughed, that bright, unguarded sound that had become his favorite thing in all the world. "You're getting sentimental in your old age, Shadow King. Next you'll be writing poetry. Bad poetry, the kind that would go in your special section." He kissed her, soft and lingering. "Perhaps," he murmured against her lips. "Or perhaps I've just been waiting my entire life for someone to teach me how." And in that moment, in the warm glow of the library that she had reorganized and he had learned to love, the fortress felt less like stone and more like home. The shadow and the hurricane, the king and his unwanted hostage, had found in each other not just partnership, but peace. Not just strategy, but love. Not just survival, but belonging. The onyx spire. Once a monument to isolation and power, had become a sanctuary of belonging and joy, and the man who had built his entire world on being untouchable, on being feared, on being alone, had learned, at last, the profound courage required to let someone in, to be vulnerable, to be loved. It was, Theron thought as he held her close, watching the firelight dance across her face as she returned to her book, the only conquest that had ever truly mattered. The only victory that had ever filled the emptiness in his chest.